Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Why Open Source Audits Are a Must, Not a Maybe. My name is Stacy Potter, and I'm one of the many marketing managers here at Flexera, and it is my pleasure to moderate today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to take care of a couple of housekeeping items. Most of you will be logged on and listening to this through your computer audio. If the sound quality isn't good enough or if it deteriorates at any point during the webinar, this can usually be resolved by refreshing your browser. If refreshing doesn't do the trick, please reach out to us via the chat window and someone will help you resolve the issue immediately via the chat function. I'd also like to point out that you can ask a question at any time during the event via the chat window, and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation during our Q&A session. We are recording the webinar today, and each of you will receive a link to the recording and a PDF of the slides within the next 24 to 48 hours. It will also be available for replay on our website. I'd like to start by introducing our speaker, Ethan Lee. Ethan is currently the Director of Worldwide Professional Services for Flexera Software Composition Analysis Group. He is responsible for driving Flexera SCA's ever-growing services team, performing baseline and M&A audits, training and implementation for more than 200 customers. Before joining Flexera, he developed and ran Cisco's M&A open source due diligence process. With over a decade of experience in the open source space, being on both the audit producer and consumer side, Ethan is well versed in helping clients understand and remediate open source risk. With that, Ethan, I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, thanks Stacy. Hi everyone, appreciate you joining me today for the webinar. As Stacy mentioned, we'll be covering the topics on why open source audits are a must and not a maybe. The agenda for today is for us to give you the basic reasons of what are the triggers for open source audits, then move on to talk about the best practices regarding open source usage, as well as how to, what are the best practices for technical due diligence, and that all leads into, well, if you were to go and approach a code audit, how will you be prepared for that? So let's jump right into it. Let's take a look at the reasons why open source audits are typically triggered nowadays. By far the most popular reason is during a code transaction. So for an M&A, a divestiture, when the code exchanges hands from one company to another, people want to know what are the risks that they're absorbing. We also see these trigger events coming from just general risk assessment, risk management, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt of knowing what is in your code. I'm sure many of you have probably heard about the OpenSSL Heartbleed, Apache Struts issue, Equifax, potential court cases regarding busy boxes, things like that, that always trigger an event that says, what is in my code? Am I at risk for those types of issues? We also see that in the last 10, 20 years, the industry has moved from open source audits as not just a nice to have, but almost a requirement checklist when you're going through any kind of diligence. For M&As, for IPOs, for people who are going up for investments, they're typically asked for what is your bill of material for third-party and open source usage. We also see more customers are asking their vendors on giving me that list, what is in your code. I want to make sure that your code hygiene is up to date and you're okay and compliant. One reason listed here is litigation triggers, obviously, an open source audit. Now, obviously, that's not an area you want to be in and not a reason you want to be triggering that audit, but it does happen. Now, we've dealt with cases where one company will say, I know you're using my code. I'd like to know what's going on there, and there's a lawsuit that's going on. So when all these events are triggered and someone comes to you and say, let's do an open source audit, naturally there's going to be some questions regarding, well, what does that really mean? There are many challenges that you have to overcome or answer these questions. For example, how much open source is in our code? All right, what are the vulnerabilities that we have? Does Heartbleed affect us? Did Apache Struts affect us? What is a copyleft license? What are the open source licenses in general that we're using and we should be aware of? It all boils down to, you're going to have to ask yourself, when was it that we did our last audit? What was the outcome of that? And especially if you're involved in M&A, which many companies are nowadays, you're probably buying one company a year, two companies, three companies a year. You want to ask, when we did that acquisition, do we know what really we are absorbing? How much risk are we absorbing into our company? And once you start answering these questions, it comes down to the software supply chain, right? Open source can enter anywhere in your software supply chain. And let's be honest, the software supply chain hasn't really changed, right? You are getting code from your partner. You are getting code from your supplier. You're writing your own code, right? What has changed is the composition of those code, right? 15, 20 years ago, you could tell your team, development team, that, hey, we need an authentication module for our website. 15, 20 years ago, that would mean that a developer would go sit at their desk for a couple of days, weeks, whatever it might mean, and develop the code, test it, and say, here, we have it, ready to deploy. It all works fine. This is something that they wrote. Nowadays, that activity is basically a Google search. That is a search through the third-party framework that they're using to bring in plugins or some glue code to make this happen. To the developer, they're doing the right thing. They're absorbing this. They're making this happen in much shorter time, but inadvertently, they're introducing third-party code to your company that you're not aware of. And imagine this is your company. What about the suppliers that's providing you code? They're going through the same thing as well. They're all under the same time pressure to get functionality out, but what are the actually third party that they're introducing, what are the risks they're introducing? And what we've seen here from our team doing audits and things like that, just basically in general, the knowledge gap has widened in the industry, right? It's the proverbial Titanic iceberg that you see here, right? People still only know the tip of the iceberg. If you look at data from the last 6 years of us doing audits, people typically only tell about the same amount of open source code that they know about. But because of the nature of open source, the nature of third-party framework, the accessibility of open source, your iceberg underneath the surface is ever growing. And that increases your risk and increases the need for you to do an open source audit. So now that we've kind of established that baseline, right? Listen, you are going to have open source. You are going to use it. There's an increasing amount of it, and the industry is demanding you to provide a more verbose disclosure list on what you're using. Let's take a look at what is really open source, right? Many of you probably have heard of different licensing, of copyleft, viral, GPL. You've heard these, but what are they beyond just buzzwords? What do they really mean? So when taking a look at open source, let's establish some ground rules first, right? The first ground rule is you have no right to use someone else's code without their permission. You are not open source if you don't have a license, right? Open source does not mean it's free to distribute or modify or use within a commercial product. At the end of the day, you are developing commercial software that you like to have as your own intellectual property and sell. You want to make sure that you're using compliant code and can still make money off of that, right? But the very nature of open source is that it's out there. People are seeing it. People are using it. People are applying different licenses or no license at all. A few years ago, GitHub did a survey of everything that was hosted on GitHub, and I think they came out with a statistic that over 70 to 80% of the code hosted in GitHub has absolutely no license attached to it, right? That is scary. As your developers are looking for modules, for different code to use, they're going to GitHub saying, I'm going to download this project and use this, but they have absolutely no idea what the license is associated with it. No, what you don't know scares you more than what you do know. If I know what the license is, I know what the obligations are that I need to follow. If I don't know, that's a major risk to my company. That leads into the third point, right? In open source licensing, obligations are typically triggered by a distribution event. If you are shipping your product that has open source code in there, that triggers the obligation. And in the open source world, the last point here is kind of one of the major tenets here is that he who distributes the code last is responsible. If you are shipping your code out there and someone is using it and they see that potentially you could be in violation of using code in the wrong way, using a GPL in the wrong way, they're going to come knocking on your door. It does not matter if that violation was found in your own code that you developed or was supplied to you by a supplier. It is your responsibility to go fix it. And when not, you have to go and find a workaround for it or go up the chain, ask your supplier to fix it. You need to fix a problem, and that will have a material impact on your shipping product, on your revenue stream, potentially litigation on that. So it is up to you to determine who it is, and you are the last stop stopping point there, that they will come to you. Now that we established the ground rules, how can you actually educate yourself and your team in order to be more verbose and understand how to apply these ground rules? And the next 2 slides here can cover some cheat sheets that I'd like to equip you with. The first is regarding licensing, right? There are many different licenses out there, right? You're going to hear viral license, permissive license. So how do they rank in terms of where you should be worried about, right? Typically, we place any copyleft viral license as we call priority 1 license, right? These are the licenses, and the reason they're called copyleft or viral is that they have certain clauses in them that requires that if you are to make any modifications to it, you must contribute the code back. Or if you're going to use it in any way, such as static linking, dynamic linking, there's going to be different obligations to be triggered that could potentially, at the end of the day, contaminate your code base. Take, for example, the GNU General Public License. Very popular copyleft license out there. What the GPL license requires is that if you modify the original project code, all those modifications must be contributed back to the project. Now, if you actually added any intellectual property in there to tweak it for your own need, you just lost your intellectual property, right? They also require that if you are using a GPL component library and you are linking it statically or dynamically against your proprietary code could potentially be considered what we call a derivative work, and that derivative work must also be contributed back to the project itself. Again, that means that your code base is now at risk because you could actually have to release your intellectual property back into the project, right? Other copyleft licenses may have triggers that said if you do any modifications, you must retrieve back, but you can use it in this particular walled garden kind of way. So you want to make sure that you understand the obligations behind every one of those. As we move down the priority list, we get into priority 2, where you have your commercial licenses, your vanity licenses, and your unknown licenses. Right? Commercial licenses, at the end of the day, they're less risky because you can essentially pay your way out. It may not be desirable, but it is a way out. Right? Unknown licenses, as I mentioned, are a little bit more risky in that, well, if you don't know what the license is, how do you actually apply it? How do I know what to do with it? You may have to go contact the author. There's just more hoops you have to jump through. So you want to make sure you know what all the unknown licenses are out there. And then we move into the priority 3 and 4, which is essentially where I would consider you want to stay. It's your sweet spot in open source licensing. These are the permissive license, or ones that have multiple license choices, but permissive license is an option of it. And when we say permissive licenses, essentially we mean that these are licenses that allow you to use the code, modify it, link in any way, just ship in any way, but just give the author some attribution. Right? Just make sure the copyright is maintained. Make sure you said that this came from Jon Snow. Right? So these are very easy things to fix, very hygienic things that you can fix very easily. No one's really going to come knocking your door saying you've stolen my code, potentially. On the right side of the slide here, you see our Flexera Field Guide to Open Source Licensing. This is essentially a cheat sheet that we provide our customers as well to kind of break down the priority of different licenses and what it means when you're actually using these licenses. Right? This is a very handy thing for you to have, for your developers to have, for your organization to have to establish those common understanding of open source licensing. The next cheat sheet that we like to equip you with is obligations cheat sheet. Right now, as we were discussing licenses, you heard me use a lot of terms like copyleft, viral, attribution, disclaimer, patent, all these things. What does that really mean? What does that really imply? Right? This is a good cheat sheet for you to have to make sure that you understand what are the obligations that are involved when you're reading through the licenses. Right? Let's be honest. The developer's job is to develop code. Their job is not to read through pages and pages of licensing and understand it, right? The license was written by legal folks in legalese. They're not going to understand it. They shouldn't. That's not their job to try to understand it. Their job is basically make sure they know what are the different terms to pick out to understand what are the different obligations and have a basic understanding of that to help them with explaining where they're using certain things and communicating to the appropriate folks why this is necessary or why it's not necessary that we can use this, what are the risks there. So now that we've kind of covered the basics of open source usage, the best practices of it, the cheat sheets of it, The next piece that you're going to take a look at is, well, what is really in my code? What is my danger zone? Where am I on this heat map of open source licensing and risk that you're talking about? So for that, I would suggest there's three kind of great scale that you can take a look at, and they're all related. Right? So first scale that you can take a look at is the risk profile in terms of what your application is. Right? As mentioned, in open source, obligations and open source obligations are triggered when you distribute code. Right? So obviously, if your application is something that is fully distributed, we're talking about the mobile apps, we're talking about the on-premise server that you provide to someone to have your entire product on there. These are all distributed code. They're all installed software. They're all coming, leaving your company. That's your highest point of risk in terms of obligations and open source licensing. So you should know everything in your code base and be able to stand up and justify and say, we know we're using these things. Here's the disclosure list. We're in compliance. As you move down to the lower risk side, you're going to end up around where it's actually very popular right now. It's a software as a service model, right? Everything is hosted. You technically don't distribute anything. People log into a platform somewhere and they pay to use or however it is, and they don't own anything. Now, we say this is lower risk because it's not risk-free. Even though you're in a hosted situation, there's still points of risk, and the points of risk lies in where your code and where your product is visible to the customer. That can be in a JavaScript, your fonts and images. Remember, images and fonts, anyone can go on the website and see that is a Helvetica bold font. Anyone can go there and see that is an icon that links to Facebook. Folks can go and do a view page source and see exactly what the raw JavaScript source code is. These are all exposure points for you that people can scrutinize. What's also interesting is with JavaScript, it's also in this gray area, right? It is raw source code. It is hosted on your server, but then it's downloaded and run on the client browser. What's interesting about this is it still lays in this gray area in the open source world because there's been no precedents or rules that said that is this considered a distribution event or not. So we've seen customers to basically establish their own policies against JavaScript. And more often than not, they'll be on the conservative side and say, let's just consider distributed code and deal with it as distributed code. The other risk factors is in the licensing, right? Obligations of open source are triggered when you distribute the code. When you don't distribute the code, you can kind of be in that hey, I'm hiding behind that wall of non-distribution, not worry too much about licensing, but there are still licensing that you need to be considerate about. One of the most viral licenses out there, if not the most viral license out there, is the Faro GPL. The Faro GPL was developed to close the loop, close the gap, because people were saying, I'm using GPL code, but I'm in a SaaS model. I don't distribute anything. I'm okay. I don't need to follow anything. A Faro GPL was developed to make sure that that gap is closed and say, even though you're using it in a hosted environment, you still need to be compliant. It's still considered distribution over the network. The Sleepy Cat license is sort of similar to that. It's very viral. It's in an instance where you're using, typically we see this with Berkeley DB, they have a Sleepy Cat license. And the license basically said, if you are using this component under Sleepy Cat, any code that interacts with it, you need to tell me about it. So, depending on interpretation, how extensive you're using that, you may actually be at risk of releasing your own intellectual property code to interact with that. So you want to be very careful when you see a Sleepy Cat license. The GPL or the LGPL version 3 is the updated version of these two licenses, and it has a potential security risk and patent risk around it. So you want to make sure that your legal folks are very well aware, and your developers are very well aware why they're using things under these licenses. The next risk profile you want to consider where you sit on the spectrum is in the code type, right? Now that I know that I am a SaaS company or a fully distributed on-prem product company, what really goes in my code? At the far right, on the very high risk, is what we call glue code, right? Like I've mentioned, developers nowadays are just leveraging their frameworks to pull in all these different components, plugins to make things work. But because of that, they're introducing so much third-party in there, right? If you're using Ruby on Rails, No, it's very common that you will find hundreds of Ruby gem files or plugins in order to make the system work underneath the hood. Same thing with node modules. Now, when we do our audit, if we see a folder called node modules, we typically find 50, if not hundreds of node modules underneath. But that's where you have very high risk code base. And as you move down the scale to lower risk one are the homegrown ones where you say you've developed everything, right? Again, it's low risk. It's not, that is risk free, right? So, you want to consider where you sit in the scale. And the interesting thing is if you look at the first scale, you might say, I'm a SaaS company. I know I don't have any Affero GPL or CPCAT license. I'm a relatively low risk. But if I take a look at what goes in my code, I'm using Ruby on Rails. I'm using node modules. I have a ton of third party in there. And what you want to consider when you're going through this exercise is always in the back of your mind, ask the question, this is where I sit now. Where's my product going in the future? Is there any instances in the future where I might consider making my product an on-premise solution? Because if you do, your risk factor of being a SaaS solution just got moved way over to the right, and now you're two reds, right? You're high risk on both application type and code type. The third scale that you want to judge yourself on is regarding, what are the belts and suspenders in terms of processes I have in place to make sure that my company is doing the right thing in open source, right? The very high risk one are the ones that when you ask this question and they say, I have none. I trust my developers to do the right thing. They don't know anything about open source, but I'm sure they're doing the right thing. And then as you move to the lower risk one, obviously, you have more a well-documented policy. You may even have an open source review board within your company that establishes ground rules on what can and cannot be used. You do regular audits on your code base. You incorporate code reviews to account for open source. And you might even be an active contributor back to the open source world, releasing your APIs, releasing SDKs. Your developers might have portion of their time fixing bugs for open source code. So based on these three scales, you basically kind of put a marker on each one of them and say, where are we on there, and what are the risk factors, and how should we approach it? And whenever you're discussing this, one of the major things you're going to ask is, well, I only know about these things if I know what is in my code. And a lot of time, we find that customers may or may not know everything in their code, right? You say, give me everything in your code, and they'll say, okay, here's my code, here's what's in my main branch. But that's not necessarily everything that you are at risk for, right? It's required that you should take a look at all source and binaries for all proprietary as well as third-party code, including vendors and outsourced firms that you're using, right? You should, you don't forget to ask the vendor, right? If the vendor comes to you or the supplier comes to you and say, here's a binary that I provide to you, and that's it. You have no access to source code. You should ask the vendor, well, can you give me your third-party bill of materials and make sure that you're okay? Can you give me some identification if there's any issues found within it? The other thing you want to consider is anything that's not part of your code repository, right? That's not part of your main product line. Things such as back-end tools and scripts, in-the-field toolkits. You might find that there's a USB drive sitting with your support engineers or sales engineers that has all these useful tools and scripts that they've used for years to get customer up and running, and something even gives it to customer. And none of these are ever checked into your main code repository as a company. It might reside with a team, a couple of people might know about it, but these are exposure points that you need to be able to incorporate and make sure that those code gets audited as well. You also want to consider what version of the products are out there. Right? If you say 99 out of my 100 customers are using the latest and greatest product, but there's that one customer that's using a product from 5 years ago and we can't upgrade them yet because of their restriction on certain environments we can't deal with right now. That immediately double your risk factor because now you have to consider that both those products are distributed and you have to audit both products. The last 2 points here is regarding alpha, beta, or POC code. Right, you have to remember whenever you're looking at open source auditing or looking at your code base, this is a point in time, right? Your development team is not going to stop developing to wait for you to finish your audit, right? It could be a week, could be a month, could be months, years that you're doing audit. They're not going to wait. Code will continue moving, company will continue moving. So you want to consider if developing features that be added to your product, when they're going to be added, how much they're going to impact your software, and pull those in as necessary based on those the timeliness of it. Proof of concept code can also be affected, right? The proof of concept might be a very early version of something that's glued together to show and tell, but they should also be included as part of your code audit. Excuse me. Now, I want to spend a quick minute here on M&A risk, right? Everything we've talked about was regarding, let's take a look at your code. I can go and ask these questions directly to people in my organization, in my company, know the answers to. But no, as we mentioned, one of the major reasons that audits are triggered is M&A activities. So in an M&A situation, there's even more risk for this because essentially you are looking at a black box of code, right? You do not have access to that code base for legal reasons, right? You do not want the acquisition to fall through, and 3 years from now, you as a company develop a potential competing feature in your product of a company that you try to acquire, and they say, well, you can develop that because you looked at a code, and that gave you an unfair advantage. It's a very, very valid reason. We've seen the litigation come up because of that. So you as a company are now looking at a black box. So we highly recommend that you get the code audited by a third party. You're under a time pressure. And even when you do that, afterwards, you should set up the expectation that you're going to repeat the same process after acquisition. You're going to integrate it in, go through your own process of auditing it, or have a third party do it again, because as mentioned, code development does not stop. You might sign in December, the deal does not close to June, and during those 6 months, you do not have access to code, and the product continues rolling on, right? So during those 6 months, what are the unknown risks that was introduced into that code base? The last point here is actually a pretty interesting, funny one that we find from doing this for over a decade, is that you want to ask the same questions multiple times when you're dealing with M&A. If you're looking at the risk factor and say, hey, did you ever give raw source code to one of your customers, right? There's a situation where you ask a question to the CTO and they'll say, no, of course not. You ask to the VP engineering, like, why would I ever do that? That seems ridiculous. You talk to a product manager, like, nope, we do not. And then you get down to the lead developer who was working on this one proof of concept for the client they're trying to land. And he said, oh, well, there was that instance a year ago where I wrote some code and it's sitting at the customer code site right now, right? So don't be afraid to ask the same question multiple times to multiple audiences, because you might find that the answer will change and that impact your risk a lot. Okay. So now that we've covered, you need an open source audit, right? Here's how you would approach it, knowing open source licensing and obligation in general. Here's where I would stand in terms of my code-based risk factor. Let's take a look at, well, how do you peel the onion, right? And the reason I say that is going to become very apparent in the next slide here, is with I love this quote, is that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. And this personifies the approach to open source auditing, right? It's key to remember that this is an iterative process. You do not want to boil the ocean, right? You may have 10 products, 20 products. You cannot expect to get everything done within a week, a month. It may take years. It may take many tries of this to make sure that you perfect the process. And it's an ever-evolving process, right? Second is that education is going to be key in your organization, right? You can do code audits 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, every month, every quarter, every year, however it is. But you're always going to discover issues unless across the organization, down to the developer, down to the legal person, down to everyone, they understand why they should or should not do certain things, why certain licenses are bad, and why they need to follow these process. If they do not understand that, you're always going to have unknown risk, right? If you go through this in a static point in time and the developer who's writing functions doesn't understand what GPL is, they're just going to grab code that could be GPL. So continual education in your organization will be key for you to lower your risk, to shorten the timeline for diligence, and at the end of the day, to save you money. The last 3 points here is very key here as well, right? You need to understand that there is no easy button, right? A tool can only go so far. You need people in the process, right? There are great automation out there. There are great tools out there that can go and identify third-party packages because they're just structured in a nice way. They have nice manifests. They tell you certain things. But there is no machine that can take a look at a piece of code and see a comment that says, code based on Stack Overflow article, here's the link, and tell you definitively, without a doubt, that is a violation or not a violation of open source. That requires a trained human being to make an educated investigation on it and rationalize it and see if this is a true positive or false positive. So you need to understand on that gradient scale, automation can get you only so far. It may get you that 80-20% point that you want to be at, but you want to go to 400%. You need to educate your people and make sure your people are involved in the process because they are the key, the linchpin to make sure that whether or not that 5 lines of code can get you in trouble or not, right? So how do you actually approach this? And I would suggest these 10 steps, right, to getting started on your internal audit. Now, these are not set in stone. This is not the 10 Commandments. You should modify this to your liking here, but this would be a suggested step if you're going to approach an open source audit or technical due diligence, right? First is get the right people in the room, right? We find that having legal, engineering, product management in a room is very helpful, right? The engineers are the one that writes the code, so they can explain to you what the heck they put in there. Product management determine what the direction is, why this is necessary, and legal is there to give you the final step that this is okay to use. Now, equipping all those functions with the cheat sheets on open source, with the risk factor scale, that will help bridge the gap between a legal person talking legalese and obligations and an engineer talking about what is static linking against dynamic linking, and that will help the communication a lot. Second is you want to deliver basic open source training, licensing, use, and establish the ground rules, which is the third one. And again, you can leverage the cheat sheet that was provided. You can leverage our field guide to establish a basic understanding first, so that everyone is on the same page. Because if you're not on the same page, the conversation is not going to go well, right? Fourth is you want to start with one product, right? It's an iterative process. You do not want to boil the ocean. You do not want to throw all your products into the mix right now. So let's go audit everything. It should be overwhelming, right? You want to, there's kind of two extremes I mentioned here. It's either a flagship product or your small app, right? Your flagship product is going to be your, the biggest one you have, the one that brings in the most revenue. So obviously that's the one you want to be well protected. But if you say that might be too big of a thing to bite off now, we want to really slow roll and understand the process, refine the process before we really tackle that big product. Then I would suggest going with a smaller app, the one that's very easily consumable, a smaller version of the product, fewer code, fewer binary things that to approach this in a more piecemeal way. Fifth is once you've selected that product that you want to audit, where do you sit on the risk spectrum, right? Use the three risk spectrum that was presented here. So am I a SaaS company that has a lot of open source? Am I a distributed one that doesn't have any open source at all? And where do I sit in terms of the belt suspenders processes I have in place? Yes, no, maybe. Do I have none of these? Do I need to start developing these or not? Based on that, then you want to start your own disclosure, right? Ask your own people what they're using. What do they know? And I can almost guarantee you, you're going to see that iceberg effect that we covered earlier in the talk, right? You're going to see that they may tell you 30 things, and once you go through the whole process, you might find 300 things, and that's fine because this is, again, an iterative process. If you go through it the next time, they're going to tell you the 300 things, and you might only find an additional 50. And that's the refinement you want to do in this process. Seventh is you want to get a third-party scan or bring some kind of scanning tool in-house to help you automate some of this process as much as possible. Remember, automation gets you so far, but it really does help, right? If you know that you're using Ruby on Rails or Node.js, you're going to have hundreds of third-party, right, that a tool can help you just itemize that so you can spend your time, your money, your effort on identifying things that are not easily identified by a machine, right? 8th and 9th point here is, well, once you know what is in your code base, I know I'm using 300 node modules under various licenses. The question is going to be, what now? Right? What do I really do with it? What do you mean I need to remediate it? I know there's a risk there. What do I do? Right? And we'll cover that in the next couple of slides here. But you want to start that process. And then at the very end is rinse and repeat. I did this one iteration. What's my next iteration going to look like? I want to get deeper and deeper in my code base. Or I'm going to say I've finished one product. Let's move on to the next product, and let's establish baseline across our company, and then we'll go deeper. Right? And so then let's take a look specifically at points 8 and 9. Right? I know what is in my code base now. What the heck do I do with it? And here's a recommended flow that I would suggest. First off, you want to cover basically what we call are the highest risk priority ones here. Right? These are, you process your high risk vulnerabilities. You see Heartbleed, take care of that right away. You see Apache Strut, take care of that right away. That took down Equifax, you need to care about it. Right? Second is you want to process all the strong copy of licenses. These are the ones that was mentioned before, like the Federal GPL, the General Public License version 2, version 3, the lesser General Public License, LGPL version 2, version 3. You want to cover anything that has a commercial license or permissive license. Any unknown licenses should also be covered in priority 1 as well already, right? And then finally, you can get down to what are called the priority 3, and these are the kind of the hygiene issues that are here, right? And I apologize, there's a mistake in the slide here on the third bullet point, but these are basically should be only the permissive license items here, right? These are BSD, Apache, attribution, things that sort that you need to process, and we'll fix this before you get the slide deck. And then once you kind of go through this to address 8 and 9, right? Remediate it, you want to go through the same process, right? It's very important to note that once you tell your developers, when you know your organization that I know that's a risk, I know I need to go fix it. You ask someone to go fix it, you should rescan the code, make sure that's fixed, right? Because again, it might happen inadvertently. A developer might go and fix a GPL issue by grabbing a code snippet from another GPL source that they didn't know about. And you eliminate one issue, but you replace it with another. Okay? The other thing we want to take a look at is, let's take a look at M&A, right? If this is what I go through as my internal process, how do I apply it to the M&A process? Because I do not have full control over that. I am looking at a black box of code, right? So you definitely want to add time to your diligence timeline. Make sure that you do an open source scan. Do a remediation. You want to ask the target for their open source policies and disclosure, and this can be very telling, right? If you ask the company, what are your open source policies? Can you give me your disclosure list? Do you ever tell your developers how to use open source? And they say no, immediately on that risk spectrum, they're on the high side. Do you need to ask more probing questions, right? We definitely recommend that you engage with a third party to do a scan. Determine the timeline and how deep you need to go in that scan. You should prioritize any remediations before signing, right? If you know immediately that they're using a fair GPL, that's very bad. You should remediate that before you even sign the deal if you want to do this. If you find out that they actually distribute raw source code to customers somewhere, that's a high risk factor, right? And this all echoes back to the point that ask the same question multiple times when you're going through the M&A process, because it's very probing on that. And you should set up the expectation that after we close this deal, we're going to go and redo this process. The development cycle does not stop, and you're always continually be adding risk. You want to make sure that once they're absorbed in your company, that they follow the same policy you put in place, and that you are going through the same process to eliminate those risks. And the last slide I want to cover here is it's titled "Questions to Ask During an M&A Audit," right? And the reason why I kind of ended here is because all these questions, yes, they apply in an M&A world, but they're kind of universal. When you talk to your own developers, your own company, you should bring up these questions, and you should ask these questions to multiple people, multiple perspectives, and see what they come out with, right? Things like, do you have an open source usage policy and compliance practice at all? Do you use any third party to develop your code? That means, hey, you're getting supplier code. What is their policy on that? How can we be reassured that they're doing the right thing? Do you ever contribute code back to the open source world? That'd be very telling for you to know, you know what, if they are telling their developers it's okay to contribute open source world, developers are actively doing it, how are they doing it? They should have some kind of policy in place. They probably have some education around that. That's fantastic, or could be very wrong, right? One question we typically ask also is, have you ever distributed the code to a customer? Now, to be honest, 99 out of 100 times you will hear the answer no, and that's perfectly fine. But you always want to ask that question because there's going to be that one time that someone's going to tell you that we had that POC when we were a scrappy startup sitting at that first customer that we tried to land, and they still have it, right? Also, you want to see, what kind of risk factor are they? SaaS, are they on-prem, things of that sort. And then you want to see, and then you want to ask the same question again and again, right? Who's your vendor? What identification? What else standards do they give me to make me feel reassured that honestly you're doing the right thing? Okay. So to kind of wrap it up here. So I hope that the webinar we cover the reasons why open source audits are triggered and provide you with some quick guide and best practice on open source usage, as well as evaluating where your code is at, and kind of walk you through a quick recommended process flow here if you want to approach doing an open source audit. So I think I'll end it here and open up the line for any questions.
Okay, thank you, Ethan, for that great presentation. And just as a reminder to everyone, if you have a question, just type it into the Q&A or questions panel in your application there, and we'll get to it. So we've had a couple of questions come in. And the first one is, I guess, what can code owners like me do going forward post-audit to better manage our use of open source?
Yeah, great question, right? So I mean that echoes back to, I know all my risks. What the heck do I do with now, right? So I definitely recommend going through that process flow to address each of the issues. Once you do that, you want to make sure that rolls back into your organization, right? You should establish a continuous scanning process, establish a common place for folks to know what issues existed, how it was remediated, what are the outcomes comes of it. When we do our audit, when we provide a report, we advise our customer to use that report as a springboard, right, and start commenting on each of the issues found. So, for example, if they find that they're using iText, very popular component out there, common component out there, and iText is available under the Federal GPL or commercial license, right? The report will say that. Here's where's that, the description, where the files are affected, things like that. They will take that and they will add additional comments on that item for developers to fill out and their organization fill out. They will say, well, what license are we really using it under? How is it linked into our code base? What is the determination on modification, right? And based on that, you can quickly break down and say, well, you know what? We are using under Fair GPL. We have to go get commercial license. So let's go get commercial license documented there. At the end of the day, all these activities typically should result in a documentation of disclosure, right? So once that says, no, here's all my open source I'm using, all components, all licenses. If anyone asks you, give them that bill of materials. If you're looking for an example of that, now, again, there's no industry standards that says the disclosure must look this way, but there are some companies that does it very well. So if you want to take a look at that, this one is very easy for you to get to. If you go to your iPhone and you go to your settings, look at About, and Apple actually has a very good disclosure list of everything that ships on their iPhone. So that might be a great starting point and say, well, I want to get to this point or some variant of it.
Okay. And I guess in regards to the Affero license that you mentioned, we had a question come in that says, you touched upon the Affero licenses, and I want to understand how using one of those licenses triggers having to release our own code. Is it only if it has been modified, and what is the definition of modified?
great question. So I'll deal with the modification question first, right? Modification means that if you take the original source code of that component and you touched it in any way. It may sound really, nitpicking, but if you go in there and you literally remove one comment line, that's considered modification. You should prepare that package as a whole to contribute it back. Most of the time, people are not going to do that. What they will do is they may go in there and they may add an additional function. They may extend a function. Those are considered modifications. What the fine line here also is that you might have some components that, as a prescriptive way of using it, they say, here is a configuration file, and turn these flags on and off, literally change variables so that you can compile it and come out with still the component, but with certain functionalities turned on and off. That is not considered a modification in most cases. That's just considered a standard way of using the actual product as described by the owner itself, right? And again, every statement I make here, no, I'm not a lawyer, so please do run this by your legal counsel and make sure that you are compliant there, but that's typically what we see as best practice in the industry. And now specifically with the Affero GPL, right? And so let me just go up here and look at the question, make sure I get it right here. Yeah, with the Affero GPL, if you modify, as we mentioned, you must release that code back. If you're using it, and you're using a Affero GPL that's still hosted on your server side, but the work product of using that is transmitted over the network, you're still considered a distribution event. So then anything touching that Affero still needs to be under the same scrutiny as the GPL and considered a distribution event, right? And no, we can have follow-up questions on the discussion regarding the specifics of what Affero really mean. And then also with the Affero GPL, you should be very careful because it carries all the patents and the modification and everything on that. Typically, we see companies who they basically have a no clause on Affero. They do not want any Affero at all in any of their products. From what we see in the industry, luckily, the vast majority of components, open source components under Affero GPL, people offer a commercial license for it. A very popular one that I just mentioned, iText. Basically, the original author had it under MPL and commercial. He didn't get enough money, I think, and then he upgraded to GPL and commercial, and then GPL version 3 is commercial, and then finally he went, let's just put in a Affero GPL and commercial. So then people will go and pay a license for it. So a lot of times you just kind of buy your way out on it, but you still want to be very careful, and it should be under a very good reason why you're using a Affero GPL.
Couple more questions here, Ethan. One is tweaking the build process of a third-party library to make it build in a specific environment considered a modification?
Yeah, and I think I touched upon that a little bit in the previous question there. In general, I would say no, right? If it's a build, like for example, we have the new build tools, right? They'll have clauses, hey, you can use this and ship this script for the purposes of rebuilding this library, but not for anything else. If they have recommended configurations that you need to go and tweak and then build a library, it's not a distribution. It's not a modification per se. If your tweak did involve me turning on these flags and then also adding a function, obviously that's considered a modification.
Okay. And in general, are the strong copyleft licenses always requiring a commercial license in order to be able to use them?
No, absolutely not. The strong copyleft licenses, there are proper. I apologize if this wasn't underscored enough, but to underscore it here, there are proper ways to use copyleft licenses in commercial products, right? The LGPL is called the Library or Lesser GNU Public License. It allows you to use the component as a library. You can dynamically link against it without any modifications, and you're free and clear. You're okay to use it in your code base. You can't statically link against it. The GPL, you can't statically link against it. You can't dynamically link against it, but you can use it as a separate executable component, right? You don't do anything that's considered derivative work. So, for example, if I have like BusyBox, very popular GPL library out there because it has a companion of like 90 plus Linux GPL tools in it. You can use it, just not compile it as part of your code base. You can use it and make it as a separate function call. You ship it separately for your product as a separate tool and call it just as a tool. And then no, you're free and clear to use it. So there are ways to use copyleft. You just have to be careful on the very strong copyleft on how you're linking in your code base and what modification you're using on it.
Okay, thanks. And just one more question here. At what point in the open source management strategy that we have, and assuming that it's prior to an audit, should we be engaging with our legal counsel?
My suggestion is engage them as early as possible. If you have the luxury of having an open source legal person on your staff, that's fantastic. If not, there are very well-known open source lawyers out there that you can consult. And I would say involvement as early as possible. They are going to be the final gatekeeper on whether or not this is in compliance or not. So you want them to be involved. You want them to understand why you're doing this, what's the motivation from it. A lot of time we find that all these audits are triggered from legal and budgeting things that comes out of legal because they understand there's a material risk that comes from it. So typically if you're in M&A, obviously legal is already involved. We would say get them involved a lot earlier. You're establishing these policies, get a feeler for what is their understanding of open source, what are the priorities, because they can really help you with setting priorities, right? So they may say that, hey, the first iteration, we just need to know if there's a feral GPL and GPL version 2 and 3, version 3s in our code, and let's eliminate those first and then be iterative and prescriptive about it.
Okay. Thanks. I think that's all the questions. Just as a reminder to everyone, you will get a follow-up email with a link to the replay of this video, as well as a PDF of the slide deck for your reference. And with that, I'd like to thank you, Ethan, for a great presentation today, and thank you everyone in the audience for joining us. Have a wonderful day.